Both of these speakers in dialogue have such rich backgrounds in diverse areas. Nikki has been doing peace building in the Philippines for 30, 20 years? A long time. And Jonathan Stray has really been a leader and at the frontier of tech development, both in informational reporting, data journalism, and now kind of at the frontier of AI and bridging. He's been one of the key people who have really been able to bridge peace builders and technologists and be able to speak both languages, and is such a valuable resource for that. And so we're going to be asking them about their experience, but also about what they project into the future for the next 10 years, as they both kind of have their fingers on the pulse about what could be next in terms of both conflict drivers and technology solutions. And it's not that one is only a peace builder and one is only a technologist, because you'll see as they introduce themselves that they actually bridge both in really interesting ways. So this panel, the format of it will be that we'll have 20, 30 minutes for them to present, to ask each other questions and for me to ask some questions. This panel also has 30 minutes of audience questions. So as you're listening to them, you can begin to note down questions that you might have, and we'll take those there in that Q&A portion. So we'll start with them sharing about 5 minutes each about the work that they do and want to share in this panel.
All right, I'm going first then. Hello, everyone. Such a thrill to be here, and I'm really humbled to be among such a talented group full of people. I attended the first 3 Build Peace conferences, but I haven't been back since 2016, so exciting to be working in this field more actively. Okay, that's not the opening slide, but that's, oh, okay, sure. All right, so I now work at a computer science lab at the University of California at Berkeley, dedicated to AI safety. And so there's good news and bad news for AI and peace, and so I'm here to try to talk about that. Thanks. So first of all, AI already appears in many different applications and will appear in many more. I work a lot on recommender systems. You've heard some about that today in other talks. But even search engines now are AI enabled. We're starting to see chatbots. We're starting to see tools that will summarize large quantities of documents. Some of you already use such tools. And I have basically 3 goals for thinking about how AI and peace intersect. First of all, don't make things work accidentally. Second, resist adversarial actors, so people who would escalate conflict for their own personal or political gain. And third, to support the work of all of you. All right, so in the Don't Make Things Worse column, one of the major questions about artificial intelligence is how much and what types of human autonomy we should cede to machines. And next slide, please. I believe that we should not cede the decision on whether to kill someone to a robot. And there are political movements to this effect. There are a bunch of people working to get international treaties to ban autonomous weapons. How many of you are involved in such efforts, by the way? Any? A few, yeah. I think this one's an easy win. I think we should all side on the stop killer robots side of the ledger. All right, moving on. Next, recommender systems. So there's now a pile of research showing that ranking items by engagement, that is whether you click or view something, tends to amplify outrageous and divisive content. This is a particular study that puts this very clearly. The thing that gets the most likes on Facebook is when you say negative things about the out party. There are a bunch of potential responses to this. For example, a number of platforms now use different ranking systems for political and health content. So that's a basic thing we should be advocating for, is don't rank by engagement in conflict-sensitive contexts. Thank you. Large language models are also going to have relevance to peace and conflict. And this is work by Emily, who's here today. I've summarized a beautiful graphic into something that reads at a distance here. And when you ask about the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, the answer you get depends on which language you ask in. This should not be surprising because, of course, these are language models, and so we will have read different answers in different languages. This is one example of a very widespread phenomenon, which is that large language models will intersect with conflict processes, so we need to be thinking about how and what we want them to say when asked such things. All right, the second thing I think we should be thinking about is being resistant to adversaries who wish to escalate conflict. You heard in one of the workshops today this idea of bridging-based ranking, the idea that rather than just looking at what is most popular or gets the most views, we should look at what is popular among diverse groups of people. There's many different ways that you could potentially implement this, and it already exists in a few different forms. For example, community notes on Twitter, which is, I guess, now called X, used to be called Birdwatch. Facebook has experimented with this. It's also, versions of this are also used by Polis, sorry. A lot of jet lag. All right, thank you. We should also be thinking about resisting language that escalates conflict. We're hearing a lot about hate speech at this meeting, as we should. Whenever I hear hate speech at an event like this, I wonder if what people are actually talking about is dangerous speech. That is to say, speech which has a causal connection to violence. We should, if we can, get more precise about what kinds of speech lead to violence, because it's those sorts of speech we need to worry about when thinking about how AI systems allocate attention to different types of information. The third category is the more positive one. How can we support the activities of peace builders? So the most immediate application of these new AI systems, large language models in particular, is that it's now almost trivially easy to make a sophisticated text classifier. Many of you are involved in social media monitoring or analytics applications. And so some of you know that making a classifier which will recognize a certain type of speech or the occurrence of a certain type of narrative is a big deal. It's a lot of work. It's gotten much easier. This is a rating scale called the Dignity Index. It's an American nonprofit. It rates political speech about the outgroup from contempt to dignity. We were able to get near human performance, like nearly matching exactly what human raters do on this scale by feeding an LLM the coding guidelines that we gave to humans. This worked with both GPT-4 and Claude. That's new. That's a transformative technology because it means that you can now do narrative analyses. That is to say, turn masses of qualitative data into quantitative counts of a particular type of narrative without technical engineering work. This is another super interesting experiment where they tried showing 25 different messages to people. They were online interventions that you could do alone in a maximum of 8 minutes. And then they measured a bunch of conflict-relevant indicators. You can see those across the bottom. And what they found that certain indicators, such as partisan animosity or effective polarization, were actually relatively easy to move. And this held up 2 weeks later as well. So this is the most direct evidence that we have that certain types of online messages will change political attitudes in a more or less durable way. And this type of experiment opens up all kinds of research for the study of how speech changes conflict dynamics. Finally, we're starting to see a bunch of really interesting experiments with large language models. This is one that I particularly like. This is by Lisa Argyle and collaborators. And the idea here is you ask two people to come to an online chat about a controversial topic, in this case, gun control in the United States. And you give one of them a chat assistant, which suggests reframings for the things that they type according to a bunch of relatively well-known mediation strategies, such as replacing definitive statements with "I feel," acknowledging the other person's values, and so forth. And what they found is that this changed the quality of the conversation in a way that both participants agreed that it was better, more understanding, and less conflictual. Other uses people have put this to is role-playing conflict participants to train mediators. I've also heard about recent work, Grace, right? That's students of Lisa's at Notre Dame, trying to suggest responses to hate speech. So this is all in the very early stages, but I've been working with a team of folks who are trying to field test this type of chat intervention in Kenya. And the idea is we don't have enough human moderators to mediate all of the conversations that need to happen. So perhaps we can apply technology here to scale in ways that were not previously possible. Thank you. All right. Last, I want to leave you with a research agenda. This is not the only research agenda. This is one that I and some of my collaborators are pursuing. It's the simplest thing that could possibly work, which is figure out what we want, develop some sort of indicators, and use those as feedback to adjust the behavior of our machines. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's always a privilege to participate in Build Peace Conference, and this is my third conference. But I've been working and collaborating with Build Up for years. I've known Elena since 2012, when we both talked in one of the conferences on Talking Peace. And this was early on in terms of our work on the conflict monitoring system. So when she asked me to reflect on what's in the horizon for digital peace building, I was quite daunted because I wouldn't classify or define our work necessarily and primarily as digital peace building. And I feel comforted that Jonathan is here so he can cover that aspect. So I quickly understood that my role is to share how we harnessed technology in designing and developing our conflict monitoring system, how we sustained it for the last 13 years. The conflict monitoring system tracks incidences of violence in the autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao. It looks at incidences, location, actor, date, time, etc. So if you look at our CSV, it's quite noisy in the sense that you would have about 400 variables there. But I'd also like to talk about how bringing the analysis of communities into data and how data and evidence can provide strong advocacy for policy change. So in the spirit of what Julie has said earlier about this is about looking back to look forward, I'd like to propose 5 reflection points on, what we've learned in the last 13 years. First one is that identifying your why question is important, and this is not the existential "why are we here" type, but finding the core dilemma and the puzzle in the conflict context where we worked in. For us, it was, why was there so much conflict in the post-conflict moment? This is 2010, when my country was, the first Moro National Liberation Front peace agreement with the government has collapsed, and we were, the peace process with a faction group, the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, collapsed, and the peace process is on impasse. So, even with peace agreements, the first peace agreement with the MNLF, why is there so much conflict in our communities? So we were singular in our objective to contribute to understanding the interaction between horizontal, community-level conflicts and vertical, or how we defined it then as rebellion-related conflict, in the context of post-conflict settlements in the autonomous region in Muslim Mindanao. And our aim ultimately was to change policy, to contribute to changing rule systems, because that's how we defined our peace-building work. At the end of the day, it is about changing rule systems and not just a discursive exercise. So this brought us to examining what sort of information and data are important, and how do we organize it well, and how we ensure the system is robust, credible, and reliable. So this also meant questioning the idea that everything was about political violence or vertical or rebellion-related conflicts. We made it a point to monitor the many causes of both vertical and horizontal violence and developed 52 subcategories to 6 main causes that we developed to get it right or at least approximate the reality better. The parsing of conflict causes is a perpetual work, as we all know, because context changes and the system has to be a living one. So we have to constantly iterate and redefine the categories and the definitions that we developed. So this process meant unbounding ourselves from the reigning notion that relying on media reports and focus group discussions was adequate. Among the most significant changes at the outset was the aim and the effort to harness a more robust data source. So we did a really thorough review of what is the data that is available that has regularity. And the review we did turned up a potentially important source of data, and this would be controversial. We identified the police blotter reports that documented cases of conflict and crime and provided an indication of the causes of the violence. But we knew that police reports were not enough, and these reports had to be validated by others, probably less robust sources, including ever-present media reports and community reports, which would be classified then as anecdotal. So police reports were also often treated with suspicion and bias by academics, by journalists, and development agencies, despite the fact that we found that only the PNP, the Philippine National Police in my context, had the official mandate to collect crime and/or conflict data as part of their regular duties. So indeed, we soon discovered that about 90% of media reports were also in the police reports. Robustness of our system was strengthened by going beyond police and media reports to include community-level reports. We set up multi-stakeholder validation groups, and we worked with academics. The system did not start from available databases or available software. We created a bespoke system. We work with IT people, but we made sure that that system was grounded in context. So we set up dialogues with our local partners, including those who understood and studied rebellions, studied motives of actors, of why violence endures. So in other words, the system sprung from life. We have people on the ground. We worked with partners. We did research. We did surveys. We partnered with tech people. We engaged with academes. We engaged with math majors. We engaged physicists, geodetic engineers, GIS specialists, and we learned and we iterated for the last 13 years. So this brings me to the next point about granularity and noise can actually provide clarity. We went against the notion that granular data was a luxury rather than a necessity. We sought data at various levels, most critical of which was conflict information at the local level. So the system tracked incidents of violence from the village to the municipal, to the city, to the provincial level. So we got multifaceted and multi-level collection of data. This enabled us, this granular source of data, this enabled us to do more sophisticated testing of correlation. We did a lot of statistical analysis. We tried to look at causality of violent conflict. What is noise or cumbersome, perhaps, to big data? It's clarity for us, was clarity for us. This noise represented the actual conditions on the ground. Available data when we started were data that is aggregated and singular. So it was lumped together. Issues related to land, illicit economies, and environmental issues were aggregated into singular categories with little differentiation. This limited and selective nature of data proved sufficient in economic analysis, perhaps risk analysis, catering to the information needs of diplomats and the risk and monitoring and advisory firms that were doing work in the Bangsamoro. However, this was hardly an effective tool in fostering peace and development where it mattered most: the village, up to the municipal, and up to the provincial level, in the creation and the design of inclusive and effective development and peace-building interventions at the grassroots. So internal to us as well, the granularity was a source of new knowledge and new thinking. So we said, a lot of the monitoring and evaluation that we did, we looked internally. We were working on reducing land-based conflicts. We looked at whether or not our interventions were able to decrease incidents of violence in relation to land and resources in areas where we work. And we soon found that sometimes when you see the shift in the nature of violence from land-based conflicts or identity-based conflicts to common crimes, that for us meant an indicator of development, and that meant it's incidents of individual violence rather than collective violence. So we measured our peace-building impact in that way. Fourth, quantitative data is only a snapshot of a particular moment rather than a moving picture. So our efforts at using social media, cell phones, two-way radios, and working with disaster risk and reduction management officers at the local government level in the Bangsamoro as early responders to monitor critical events is an attempt at capturing the moving picture of conflict at the local level. The new system we have developed, born out of our understanding of how we developed and how we implemented the conflict monitoring system, we now call it the Critical Events Monitoring System, is an important improvement in terms of immediate recording and reporting of incidents and analyzing these incidents. And we have 72-hour cycles for gathering and analyzing data, working with strong networks on the ground. The difference between the conflict monitoring system and the critical events monitoring system is that we did not use panel data in our analysis, but rather the reports of people as they find and how they define critical events in their areas. Our connection to media, broadcast media in particular, has proved powerful as an early response mechanism. For the last 2 years, we run a daily 1-hour radio program, an AM radio program that airs across the Bangsamoro region, where we report critical events as it happens, and we provide a platform for communities to raise issues. But at the same time, surface the different perspectives on issues by bringing those who, on the other side of the issue, can also talk about their side. We were tracking how polarization turns violence, how a singular incident that is an individual violence can become collective. But we are not there yet in terms of really determining at what point, what are the conditions by which individual violence becomes a collective one. We need to improve our strategies. We and our partners find it very difficult to respond, especially on collective violence that is identity-based or that is politically motivated. And broadcast media has been our second best in terms of quick response. In other words, technology is only one factor alongside other important tools, local tools in particular, and local knowledge, and most especially offline networks that we have, partnerships that we engage with through the years. Both IT networks, meaning access and connectivity, and dense interpersonal networks. That's what I mean when I say networks. Ultimately, it's not the sophistication of the platform, but whether or not this platform is relevant and responsive to where people are in terms of their identities, class. Sometimes when we look at identities, we forget about class, and that is an important indicator that we cannot forget, and we also cannot disregard in terms of our analysis, in terms of conflict dynamics, in terms of location, and so on. And lastly, independence and autonomy must be maintained. And I remember Diana's point about sustaining innovation. But I would add that it is important to maintain independence and autonomy. The reports and analysis we produced, whether good or bad from the perspective of different actors on the ground, have been made accessible by a database that remains autonomous and independent from government and private control, private sector control in particular, dedicated to presenting the true state of conflict and security in the Bangsamoro. So it is an important lesson on the need to constantly prevent the very real threat of potential political capture of data and the promotion of distorted narratives that hide the truth about the ebb and flow of conflict in our region, which is Bangsamoro, Mindanao. Thank you.
As I hear both of your remarks, one thing that really strikes me as a commonality is both of your strategy, that it's not research for research's sake, it's not collecting data for data's sake, but that you have specific change goals and strategies, that you have specific policies that you're advocating for at a national level, that you use your data to do so. What also strikes me is the differences that you have, some of them obvious, some of them less so. Where Nikki, you're looking at grounded, specific, regional data and evidence, where Jonathan, you're able to do experimental, perhaps generalizable findings. And obviously just your own professional positions that you're coming to these questions from. So first thing is we'd like to give them an opportunity to ask each other one question, and then we'll open it up to you, the audience. So maybe, Nikki, you can start this one by asking Jonathan a question, and then we'll go the other way.
I was actually very excited, Jonathan, to meet you because I read your work and it fascinates me. There is this phrase that we go back to again and again to test ourselves. The problem is the problem, meaning that the problem is not the solution. Finding it isn't necessarily difficult. The solution is not necessarily difficult, but finding the problem is. So with your expertise and your knowledge on big data, and we know that big data has this innate confidence that it can find the right set of data and information that can provide solutions to problems. And this is my curiosity. How do you find your why question in the midst of all this big data? And how do you search for problems in that?
Wow. Okay, well, let's take the AI hype down a notch and start by saying I think only 5 or 10% of the proposed applications for AI in peace building, but really in general, are going to work. Unfortunately, I don't know which 5% that is, so that's why we have to do the experimentation. Let me back up slightly. I spent almost 10 years of my life writing software for investigative journalists. And I raised and spent over $1 million doing that. And I don't know if it would have been better if I had just given that money to reporters. So I think we should be humble about the potential benefits and limitations of what we're doing. Having said that, one of the reasons that I work on recommender algorithms for social media, precisely because only a few platforms control so much of people's online experience, they are a leverage point. And while it is true that every conflict is specific and has its own dynamics, we are unlikely to live in a world where there is a customized recommender algorithm for every conflict, for every platform. So having said that, what we're left with is very general principles. And so I'm just trying to find the first set of principles, just the most basic design ideas that will hopefully improve matters. If we had that right, then maybe we could go on to look at, what does a specific conflict needs in terms of algorithm design. But we're not there yet. We're in fact quite a long way away from there.
My name is Haya Dennis. I'm a Kenyan here. I'm a law student, and I represent the Kenya Students with Disability Association. I've been so much instigated and very much intellectually provoked by how you were, in your data collection, you were doing public participation. But I tend to find a gap. To what extent do you involve the perpetrators of a very unpeaceful environment? You provided a case study of 2010. Because by involving a perpetrator who otherwise caused an unpeaceful environment, you will get to understand why did he even choose, or he chose to be a perpetrator in the first place. So thank you.
I liked a lot of things that you both said, unsurprisingly. And one of my favorite was, Nikki, when you said that granularity and noise provide clarity. So I want to ask Jonathan whether he agrees, what he thinks about that statement. And I want to ask Nikki, you said, unlike what many people think, or something to that effect. And I also think that it's unlike what many people fund. And I want to ask you whether you agree with that, and if so, why you think that is. Thank you.
I guess my question goes to Jonathan. It's a bit of a playful question, I guess, also to all of us, which is that when it comes to recommenders, what strikes me is that early recommenders from the 90s, earlier collaborative filtering systems, sought to, in a sense, do some form of community building, right? By finding communities of like-minded people sharing the same kinds of things. So I guess my question is, how do we, or is it possible that new peace-building models for recommenders or other algorithmic systems, is it possible that they can then generate new conflicts, just like the recommenders of the past have done before? Thanks.
How we organize our data is quite interesting, because when we look at police blotter reports, media reports, and the reports that come from our multi-stakeholder validation group, we actually do not make value judgment on who the perpetrator and the actor is. What is written in the report gets coded and goes into the system. And we understood, and from the analysis that we did through the years, that in a war or in a conflict setting, actor identity and their roles morph. At some point in the strings of violence, in the escalation of violence to further episodes of conflict because of revenge and retaliation, victims become perpetrators, perpetrators become victims, and so on in that cycle. So we record how we see ourselves in the conflict monitoring system is to record what is written down. And that's why we complemented it eventually with the critical events monitoring system, because that provided us with the granularity in the stories. But in terms of bringing perpetrators and actors together, what we did recently in the last 3 years was doing some work on restorative justice with reintegrees, because we knew from the work that we did on the ground that, for example, surrenderees or reintegrees or ex-combatants would have a fractured relationship with their communities, but then the normalization process in peace processes does not necessarily address restoring relationships or healing. So we're trying to develop that aspect, and we're bringing in other disciplines, psychologists, to make us better at making that work. But that is a nascent program that we're trying to do in communities. Perhaps I can answer on the second question. Yes, funding has been, the funding side is more because we were reporting on issues and incidences that are not palatable to political actors. So, and these political actors can influence donors. So for example, The World Bank has continuously, for 10 years, provided support for the conflict monitoring system. And we understood their decision to not fund us from this point forward, not yet, because they have a bigger, more important political goal, which meant disassociating from the conflict monitoring system. And that's why the last point about independence and autonomy and how to maintain those kinds of systems that approximates what's happening on the ground with a certain level of objectivity needs to be funded, and we're still trying to figure out how to do this as part of, investing in maybe some percentage of our work or our funding can go into making sure that this is sustained. But we're also talking to different groups and different actors and looking at what are funding modalities that might work. But political interests is really something that threatens our work.
Granularity and noise. What a great phrase. So I am all in favor of granular data because in some sense that is the source data. And it's extremely hard to get. It can be very difficult to work with. There are, for example, serious privacy concerns with getting conflict data at the individual level. And yet, you mostly can't do causal analysis on the event, on an individual event or an individual person. We mostly only know how to do that in a statistical sense. So then the problem we face is, what is the right level of analysis? If you run an experiment with all the users of a platform in a particular country, maybe you can get, it's not unusual for a platform to run an experiment with 100,000 or even 1 million people, and you can detect very small effects. Unfortunately, what you might be detecting if you have a 1% change in your experiment is 10% for 10% of the users and nothing for everyone else. So one of the major unsolved problems is, if you're trying to do causal inference, what level of analysis should you analyze at? And also, what subgroups, what heterogeneous effects should you look for? But as a scientist, yes, give me the most granular data you can get. So I really respect your commitment to the individual event data. Emily, your provocation is apt. A friend of mine, the journalist Quinn Norton, once said to me, the internet is fantastic. It's amazingly good at connecting previously atomized communities like sexual minorities and white supremacists. So this is the problem, right? All of these recommender systems, or really technology for building community in general, will build communities based around values that we here normatively think are bad. So at some point, it's not just a technical problem. You have to make your own moral judgments about what is good and bad. And of course, the politics of this are complicated. Platforms don't want to go down this route because they don't want to be parties to the conflict, understandably. And so you see a bunch of weird behavior because of this. So for example, Facebook's misinformation efforts proved extremely controversial. And so one of the things they did is they used a survey called, "Do you think this post is good for the world?" And they found that it correlated very strongly with their misinformation classifiers. And so they used that as the signal to identify and demote items, because it was more defensible publicly, even though privately they did it because of this correlation. So yes, these technologies can absolutely support values that we disagree with. At some point, we're going to have to take a stand and articulate what our values are, and the politics around putting that in code are going to be extremely complex.
For the sake of time, we're not going to take another round of audience questions, but I'm going to ask a final one, which is, what are your current and next priorities? What are the next steps for you personally, and what priorities do you hope that others here at the conference might join you on? Nikki, if you want to start, I can.
So by our name, And I'm just going to say a bit about our history. Well, we run the conflict monitoring system as International Alert Philippines. And since July this year, we have become a national entity. The whole team of International Alert Philippines has become a national entity, and we named ourselves Council for Climate and Conflict Action. We think that we're still going to be in the peace building space. We're still going to track incidents of violence, but we want to understand the relationship between climate change, climate issues, and its nexus with violent conflict. And we're beginning to look at vulnerabilities, bringing in the work that we did the last 13 years in terms of mapping, overlaying these maps, determining which areas would be more vulnerable with a combination of climate issues and conflict, and so on. So we want to be in the space where we can shape local responses and strengthen community resiliency in the face of these threats. Our why question is, it's interesting, we saw when there are disasters in my country, there is collective action. It's ironic when people are faced with a disaster and they have nothing, they would still share their bottle of sugar with their neighbor. And it's interesting that there is collective action within that context, and how within the conflict context there is polarized space. And we wanted to test whether or not that holds true until now. And is there a time frame by which this collective action exists, or is that a short-term behavior, and so on. But we wanted to understand that in relation to still the question of why violence endures, because that's still our issue in relation to land-based conflicts, in terms of identity conflicts, and in terms of political conflicts, and the high human cost in terms of displacement. So we wanted to look at all those factors in our next journey, in our next chapter, in our work as a national organization.
So one of the things that is frustrating about computers is they force you to be maddeningly specific about what you want. And what we want in the case of algorithmic media is not no conflict. You are all aware that peace and justice are inextricably connected. So therefore the question becomes, what kind of conflict do we want? And so I started asking this question, and I made this list, and this is not a comprehensive list. These are just a few things that I came up with over a weekend. But clearly, there's a long tradition of calling some kinds of conflict good and some kinds of conflict bad. Next, please. And so I found that nobody had ever done a comprehensive review of all of the ways that we think of conflict as good or bad. And so I started the project. And the point of the project is to develop a hopefully comprehensive taxonomy, like a list of types of conflict that people think are good and bad and why, and do it in 6 different languages so we can claim something like global coverage. We're going to use AI to help, although it's not really an AI project. But the point is to generate this list, then pick one or more types that we think is good in some sense, and then develop metrics or indicators for that type. And we need this type of quantitative theory of conflict if we're going to program computers to do conflict transformation, because that's the fundamental project, to shift from unhealthy or unwanted or undesirable types of conflict to the types that are healthy and promote peace and justice. So that's a long way of saying, if you're interested in this project, we need your help. It's going to be a rather long project, and we especially need people who are fluent in these languages. Thanks.